Hello everyone, this is Dr. Valentin Rivera again, but please remember this is a collaboration as well with Dr. Maria Teresa de Paoli, and together we are making possible for you to take Spanish 531, that is Spanish for professional settings, specifically related to health and human services, available for you fully online asynchronously. The second video will focus on Unit 1A, is the remaining part of it, and the focus of it will be basically divided into two. In the first part, the demonstrative adjectives are going to be covered. They are constantly used in Spanish, los adjetivos demostrativos, and we are going to be exploring the relationship that exists between the speaker and a sense of closeness in terms of space. We will also be talking about the direct and indirect object pronouns, pronombres de objeto directo e indirecto, which are frequently used in Spanish in order to replace an element that we have previously referred to. So that is to avoid repetition. Both of these elements are very briefly mentioned on pages 28 and 33 respectively. However, we also wanted to provide you with further information so that you can become even more familiar with them. Thank you so much, and we truly hope that this information is useful. I will now review the difference between the demonstrative adjectives and pronouns. But first, I will refresh your mind on what they look like. I will start by addressing the demonstrative adjectives. Here you have them. Regarding their function, demonstrative adjectives are used to point out people and objects. They indicate the relative position and distance between the speaker and an object or a person. You can see it in the following way. The closer the speaker is to the object in question, the more likely you will be required to use the adjectives on the left column. The further the objects are, then you will be required to use the adjectives in the right column. For example, este libro es mío. In this case, este reflects closeness of the speaker in concern to the book, as opposed to the idea, esos libros son azules, thus showing greater distance between the speaker and the objects. Bear in mind that like all other adjectives, they agree in gender and number with the nouns that accompany. In this case, libro, este libro, and libros, esos libros. Let's now focus on the demonstrative pronouns. As you can see, they are highly similar to the demonstrative adjectives, with the exception that the pronouns may reflect a written accent. Here is an example in context. ¿Cuáles son tus libros? That is, which are your books? To which I could answer, estos son, or son estos. As far as the function of the demonstrative pronouns, they replace the noun. As you can see in our previous example, estos son or son estos, estos is fully replacing the word books. To differentiate pronouns from adjectives, an accent mark is written on the stressed vowel. as we can see in here. Each demonstrative pronoun has a neuter form as well, different to the adjectives, as we can see here in the third column. Esto, eso, and aquello. The neuter form does not take an accent mark, nor do they have plural forms or gender. They are used to point out ideas, actions, or concepts. They refer to unspecified objects or things. For example, me parece perfecto eso que tú propones. Something similar to, I think that what you are suggesting, or what you suggest, is perfect.
Object pronouns may be used to be more fluid either when writing or speaking and to avoid being repetitive. This tutorial reviews how to identify a direct and indirect object and how to replace them by a pronoun in each indirect object pronouns. Direct and indirect objects. Direct and indirect object pronouns may be used to be more fluid either when writing or speaking and to avoid being repetitive. This tutorial reviews how to identify a direct and indirect object and how to replace them by a pronoun in each case. A brief reminder before starting the grammatical explanation. Remember that an object is the item or person that is affected by the action of a subject. Now you might be wondering what the difference is between them. That said, direct objects are those that are immediately affected by the action, like in the example,
Escribo una carta.
That is, I write a letter. The action of writing is directly affecting the letter, so to speak. Thus, the letter,
una carta,
would be my direct object. However, if I say,
escribí una carta a mi madre,
that is, I wrote a letter to my mom. My mom, in this case, is being indirectly affected by my writing since she is receiving the product of my action. Thus,
a mi mamá,
to my mom, is the indirect object in this case. Now let's explore more examples in a more detailed way. Let's start by examining one type of object at a time. In this case, direct objects. Let's do so by looking at the following conversation between Roberto and Marco.
Roberto, ¿viste la película? Marco responde, sí, vi la película.
This answer could also simply be
sí, la vi,
which would be more common to hear from a native speaker of Spanish. In this case,
la
is an example of a direct object pronoun, which is replacing the word
película.
Something similar would happen in English if you were to answer to the question, did you see the movie? With yes, I saw it, being it, the direct object that replaces the word movie. Notice, however, that in English you would find it after the verb, while in Spanish, the direct and indirect object pronouns precede the verb in most instances. I will now discuss 3 exceptions. Case 1. The instances in which the direct object pronouns can either precede or being attached to the verb is when the verb is in the infinitive form, like in the example.
Quiero leer el libro.
I want to read the book.
Lo quiero leer o quiero leerlo.
I want to read it. Case 2. The direct object pronoun must be attached to verbs that reflect a command, like in the case of
estudia la lección. Estudia la.
Study it. Case number 3. The direct object pronouns may precede or be attached to the verb when using the ing form. That is, ando or endo. Like in the example,
estoy leyendo
el guión.
I am reading the script.
Lo estoy leyendo o estoy leyéndolo.
I am reading it.
This is a reminder about the different direct object pronouns and also the indirect ones. For all the cases, all the personal pronouns, yo, tú, él o ella, which will be the singular third form, nosotros, vosotros, using Spain, ustedes, and ellos, the plural third form. In this way, we have me in both cases for yo, te in both cases for tú, lo or la for él and ella, and please bear in mind here that lo, which is not only singular but also masculine, will correspond to él, while la, which is singular but in this case feminine, will correspond to ella. In the case of the indirect object pronouns, however, what is going to matter is just going to be the number. That is, if it is singular and it is in the third form. We are going to have le. That is, in this case, gender, whether it is feminine or masculine, doesn't really have an important role. Nos in both cases for nosotros, os in both cases for vosotros, which is used in Spain, and finally, los and las, in which cases will be very similar to lo and la, but with the difference that in this case, both of them would refer to the plural form. Finally, for the indirect object pronoun, for ustedes, ellos, we will have les. Once again, similar to le, the gender doesn't really play a role here, but rather the number. That is, we are referring to the plural form.
Now, let's identify the indirect object in the brief conversation between Roberto and Luisa.
Roberto asks, ¿Tu papá envió un mensaje a Eva?
Did your dad send a message to Eva?
Luisa responde, sí, mi papá envió un mensaje a Eva.
A more common answer you will hear from native speakers is,
sí, mi papá le envió el mensaje, or sí, mi papá le envió un mensaje.
yes, he sent it to her. Notice that the le is replacing Eva, and therefore there's no need to use Eva's name again. Thus, le, that is her, is an example of an indirect object pronoun. Now be aware that not all sentences and statements may contain a direct or indirect object. So, how do we establish whether we have them? Here's a way that you can do it. Direct objects often answer to the question,
¿Qué plus verbo?
that is, what plus the verb in the sentence. Bearing that in mind, let's go to our original example, that is the brief conversation between Roberto and Marco.
Roberto pregunta, ¿viste la película? Marco responde, sí, la vi.
So, remember, you need to ask, ¿qué? Plus the verb.
¿Qué vio Marco?
In other words, what did he watch? If you have an embedded answer to this question in your sentence, then you have a direct object. In this case, we do. The answer to what did he watch would be
La película.
he saw the movie. Therefore,
la película
is going to be the direct object. That said, let's look for a pronoun that can replace it. Considering that
la película
is a feminine singular noun, our pick will be la. Thus, we can say,
sí, la vi.
yes, I watched it. Once again, remember that in most cases, the pronoun will precede the verb. In a similar manner, we can use a specific common question to identify whether we have an indirect object or not. This time, we will employ
¿A quién?
to whom, plus the main verb and the noun. Bearing that in mind, let's go back to our original example where Roberto asks,
¿Tu papá envió un mensaje a Eva?
So remember, you need to ask,
¿A quién envió un mensaje tu papá?
in other words, who did your dad send a message to? If you have an embedded answer to this question in your sentence, then you have an indirect object. In this case, we do. The answer to who did your dad send a message to is Ava, thus being Ava, the indirect object. That said, let's look for a pronoun that can replace it. Considering that Ava can be replaced by the personal pronoun
Ella,
she, that is, the third person of the singular, our pick, will be
le.
your dad sent her a message. Once again, remember that in most cases, the pronoun will precede the verb. Now, let's go back to our example about the message for Eva. However, in this case, we will explore it as an affirmative sentence rather than a question. Thus, we have. Now, let's go back to our example about the message for Eva. However, in this case, we will explore it as an affirmative sentence rather than a question. Thus, we have.
Tu papá le mandó un mensaje a Eva.
Now, let's figure out first if we have a direct object by asking.
¿Qué mandó tu papá?
That is, what did your father send? The answer, and therefore the direct object, will be
Un mensaje.
a message. Given that
Mensaje.
is a masculine singular noun, the pronoun to replace it will be
Lo.
We already know that the indirect object is Eva, given that it answers to the question.
¿A quién le mandó un mensaje tu papá?
That is, who did your dad send a message to? Remember that Eva can be replaced by the indirect object pronoun.
Le.
Now, you have two different object pronouns. Something to bear in mind is that you can and should use both, but you need to follow a specific order. You will need to write the indirect object pronoun first, and then the direct object pronoun right away, both before the verb. Thus, you will automatically have.
Tu papá le lo mandó.
When you have two pronouns starting with L, you need to substitute
Le,
or
les,
by.
se.
Then the sentence with both pronouns integrated would read as follows.
Tu papá se lo mandó.
Your dad sent it to her.